The grid system for it, the electric grid system, one of the main beneficiaries is the SUMEB Corporation. It is not going to the irrigation that's needed in the northern areas you see in the map, which is a reserve area. I think it's also important to note that SUMEB is the largest single employer of Namibians in the country. Nehas said that the average wage for the blacks is $25. Well, under figures given by SUMEB Corporation in 1973, they themselves quoted the figures as $54 in cash, $48 in kind. As this was mentioned, in kind means clothing, minimum health services, bedding, stuff like this. This was about for 4,500 blacks that were employed. The whites, 1,300, their average wage was $685 cash, and plus probably a bit more than $200 in kind. So you see right there these huge discrepancies. But I think this $54 in cash, what's important to see is that you do have some blacks that do earn a very high wage, like they do quote up to $151. So this right there is going to throw off the whole average. It makes it seem much higher. So you see the corporation trying to make it seem better than it is. As was pointed out, this in kind is of absolutely no benefit to the families left back in the reserves. I guess we could look at this right here to see what transnational, such as SUMEB, or what a transnational such as Amex and the various companies owning this, how it operates within the country and outside of the country. See, SUMEB in the middle is owned by Amex at 30%, Newmont Mining on the right by 30%, O'Keefe by, well, almost 10%. Now what's interesting about O'Keefe is that O'Keefe is primarily owned by Newmont Mining. So that's another way of hiding. Selection Trust owns 14% of SUMEB. Now this is an English corporation, UK corporation. And then we see SWACO owning part of SUMEB. Now if you look up at who is owning SWACO, you see the famous Anglo-American corporation. And this is Oppenheimer's group. You also see Charter Consolidated owning SWACO, which also owns SUMEB. So 30% there. Now we look at who Amex is working with. Amex over here owns Botswana RST, which is another mining company in Botswana. Who else owns it? You have Anglo-American also in joint work with them. Then we look down at the SUMEB Exploration Company. Now this is primarily involved in exploration, as it says. They've found new copper and lead deposits, fairly significant amounts. Anglo-American owns 25% of SUMEB. We have SUMEB itself owning 75%. Well, we've already seen who owns SUMEB. So we see very definitely the connections of Anglo-American and SUMEB. Now what is not pointed out in this here is that Standard Oil of California owns 20% of Amex. And then this is going to take us into a whole other area of where the control is coming from to this one corporation. I think it's also important to note that, as I said before, the no money really stays in the country to benefit the country, aside from the infrastructure, which in fact the corporation benefits from. Part of this, the profit, has both been used to build up Amex and Newmont's enterprises on the outside throughout the world with a 20% profit rate. You cannot find this anywhere else in the world. Let's say in the US it's like 7 to 9% generally. Also what they are doing is they're trying to develop a copper smelting plant near Cape Town. And this is in conjunction with the Anglo-American and Amex. Now what up until about 1974 they were planning to do this, and they had invested about $4 million. But as a result of low copper prices, but also as a result of the growing instability in South Africa and Namibia, they've put off developing this. And I see here is one way, I think, for pressure to be put on a corporation such as this. Obviously, it's difficult for them to be pulled out without the liberation in Namibia. But by putting pressure to keep them from opening up this smelting operation in South Africa, it's had a definite effect on Tsumeb's own operations. I think I probably should stop. I have some, if you want to clarify in this right here and any other questions. I'm a bit uncertain as to how to proceed on this because I'm not used to just talking.
At this point, we'll open it up to the members of the grand jury.
Yeah, I'd like to know what kind of measures has the United States government taken to control or limit or to penalize companies such as Amex and other U.S. corporations which are involved in what seems to be internationally illegal activities in places like Namibia, but particularly with Amex. Do you know of any measures?
Well, on the outside, the U.S. government says that it believes South Africa is illegally occupying Namibia. It has stated this in the UN, it has stated this in various world forums. But the point you bring up, they have stated that no insurance will be given to companies operating in Namibia after 1965, companies that open up, so that if there is nationalization, they cannot be paid for loss of revenue. But the catch on this is that there have been very few U.S. corporations starting in after 1965. Any country before that, any company before that, is under no control or under no. The U.S. is doing nothing to make them pull out. They allow them to subtract the taxes they pay to the South Africans. These can be subtracted in the U.S. Now here's a very blatant thing. When they're operating illegally in Namibia, they're able to subtract their taxes. So
you said that some of the most valuable minerals that are coming out of these mines are going to be exhausted in another 15 years. What is that going to mean in terms of the lives of the people in Namibia? I mean, are these just like secondary resources? I mean, what kind of effect is it going to have on the economy of Namibia?
Well, the largest industry in Namibia is mining. This is where the great wealth of Namibia comes from. It's from its mineral resources. Second, come to fishing, which is again a very, not quite as high as mining, but it's very important. And we come to farming. And each one of these sectors, this policy is being followed of as fast depletion as possible. I'm involved with another group that's involved in taking out the fish so that they are unrecoverable. They are not coming back up again. The whole idea is to deplete the country as much as possible. Now, in doing this, it ties them much closer to South Africa.
Where is the metals shipped? Maybe you mentioned that earlier, but who is Tsumeb's largest customer? Who or what countries are their biggest customers?
I don't know. I would say, okay, I'm not quite sure as to how the copper and the lead are distributed. Being a grand jury, I couldn't guess on it, but I would say that the U.S. is probably a very major buyer as well as Europe.
Have there been any significant changes in the technology of the mining operation, or do you foresee that in this exhaustion period in 15 years will be exhausting the mine using the same methods in use now?
I believe it was in 1973-74, there was a very big commitment made to increase the smelting capacity and the mining capacity. I think that they're very interested in increasing this in order to further this high extraction. I mentioned the grid, the electric grid coming from the Kunini Dam up in Angola. This is being used to heighten the extraction rate by better smelting, by better refining. So they are, particularly as the pressure is put on them more and more, from SWAPO, from internal revolts, from outside pressure, from the economy becoming more and more unstable. I think they're trying to step up their extraction as much as they can. And obviously, if we see the value of their installations or whatever have increased by 20 times, it's no loss to invest for the short term like this.
It's my understanding that Namibia has one of the higher gross domestic products per capita in the world, and yet the people are clearly starving. How do you explain that inconsistency?
I got it right here. I think that one thing that's important to see is that gross domestic product includes taking out profits, dividends, all this kind of stuff out of the country. So you have to get into, what's the other one? GNP, to see what is actually remaining in the country. So I think that's a very inflated term to use gross domestic product. So right there it's seeming like the total income in the country is much higher. The discrepancy along this line between GNP, gross national product, and gross domestic product is 50%. Now this was in 1973 according to South African sources. So that right there you're going to have to cut your gross domestic product in half to see the wealth of the country. Okay, even if we use gross domestic product, we see that and then you have to get down to per capita. The total population, supposedly, when they say it's the most wealthy, okay, that's $725 per person. But if we look at whites, it comes to $4,250 per white. The blacks in the police zone, this is the lower area, the white area, they earn $468 out of this. But again, now this is just broken down according to how many people are in this area. So then we get to the blacks in the northern sector. There's only $124. Now, if we look at what is called the minimum effective level of what's needed to support an average family, this comes out to $170. And this is, again, statistics from the white Namibian officials. This is what's needed to support them. So right there, even using this doubled gross domestic product figure, we see that the blacks in the northern sector earn $124. Now that right there is what, $50 below the minimum effective level. But if you cut this in half, that would be $60. So right there you're seeing how figures are used to very much cloud the reality of what's going on in Namibia, such as what we've been hearing here.
I'd like to know, you said in some areas that, well, first I'd like to know about your statistics. How were they arrived at? Did you talk to any Namibian, or you just got them all from the South African? How did you get them?
Well, the work that we have done, we have gotten from many different sources that have usually been published. They're secondary sources, such as work that has come out from the UN, work that has been done by churches on researching. A lot of this stuff is gleaned from published figures by the South Africans. Now, one of the things, as you most likely know, is that statistical generation is very difficult in South Africa and Namibia because South Africa has tied together almost all statistics from Namibia to South Africa's own economy. But as far as these statistics, some of them were projected from what had been in the past. Others were drawn, particularly like the wages that I talked about, the taxes that were paid were drawn from Tsumeb Corporation files, their annual reports.
Well, do you see these difference in wages? Now, you say in some areas the workers get a higher, rate than other areas. Do you see that as setting up class differences between the Namibian themselves?
I think that now, let me explain something about those areas, is that you have very much fewer people living in the southern area, if you see on that map. You had the vast majority of the people living up in the northern area. And so you have, that was only on a per capita basis, an individual basis, so that you don't see the class there. in the different sectors that much. But I think where the class is coming in, and this is also happening in South Africa, we see, like, I guess it's called the Atlanta Plan, where the corporations start paying more wages, higher wages to some of the workers, and they start upgrading jobs. I think this right here is a very definite attempt to create what would be called a middle class, black or colored or whatever, African middle class. And I think this is one of the intents to split the country. But I think that, well, I won't, it isn't here to go into a class analysis. But
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Angola recommended the grand jury that we find Amex an outlaw. You didn't have any recommendations, and if you agree with that, you've been working in this country for 2 years. What would you recommend to us to how to implement that living here in this country?
how to implement the fact that Amex is an outlaw?
How can we put some teeth into that besides just finding it an outlaw?
Well,
Assuming that we do.
yeah, assuming that you do. Well, wait until you hear the rest of the information. I think that one thing that is being done here is crucial with this gathering here and tying together what Amex is doing in Namibia and in the Cheyenne Nation. Because I think that what is very important, if we really want to assist the liberation in Namibia, is that we see how the U.S. system very much supports the apartheid system in South Africa and Namibia. But in order to bring about any fundamental change, I think we've got to start working within our own areas and focusing on the changes needed here so that we can have an effect on government positions, on the fact that the government most likely at this stage would go in if there was any, if the armed struggle continued and got much wider. I think that the U.S. government would definitely support the South Africans. So what we've got to do is both educate people as to what is happening there, but also to tie in what a transnational really is, the power that it means. Transnational has power also beyond a government. And I think until we start dealing with the power issues, there's no way that we're going to be able to have that much effect on the transnationals operating in South Africa and Namibia. But I think that also along these lines, I think that like stockholder action, calling attention to Amex, I think it's more kind of like a drip on a stone. And I think that if we're serious and if we do see Amex as an outlaw, then I think that there should be direct support to SWAPO, to the work that it's doing, to the liberation movements. But I also feel that it's very important to tie in what Amex is doing, what transnationals are doing in this country with what they're doing. If I might, with what they're doing overseas. I might give two other types of examples on this. Is there's a bank campaign right now that's going to get people to withdraw, trying to get people to withdraw their deposits and accounts from certain banks. In Chicago, what they're doing is tying together the redlining that the bank has done. The bank says we don't have money to invest in your community. Yet they say, this is how much money you've taken from our community. You say you don't have money to invest in our community, yet how come you can give millions of dollars of loans to the South African government for its military regime? Now here is a case where people see what the bank has done and how it's both being an outlaw within their own areas as well as it's being an outlaw overseas. I think also it's important with transnationals for us to see our united interests. I think that that's crucial.
And when you said that they pay taxes, they're supplemented for the taxes they have to pay in South Africa by the host country.
What was that again?
I say that they are supplemented for any taxes they have to pay in Namibia by this government. They can write that off?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I mean. By supplement.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't mean to say supplemented, I don't think. The way it is that if the money does not come back into this country, as I understand it, if taxes that are paid overseas, they are obviously not coming back into this country, so the corporation is not taxed for them here. But because they have paid these taxes out of their profits or whatever, they are able to deduct what they paid in taxes overseas from their own tax statements here.
Right. Do consumers here get a break in buying copper that comes from Namibia, as opposed to copper that is owned by the Suma Corporation that comes from here where they get less return, let's say, on their investment? Is that investment return passed on to the consumer here?
Obviously not.
My question's about security and defense of the mine. Is the mine also a defense installation? Is it defended by police or by troops? Where does it fit in a defense pattern, to your knowledge, for South Africa or the U.S. or whoever?
Okay, well, I guess there would be several levels to look at this. As far as I know, the mine is not a defense installation. But also, as far as we know, there are 50,000 South African troops stationed in Namibia. Now, one of the areas that they're training in is called Grootfontein, and this is up in that same area as Tsumeb. And this is a major training ground, both for South Africans, but also for some of the folks from UNITA and FNLA that the South Africans are training. Now, it's very true, particularly as both within South Africa and Namibia, as the resistance is increasing. South Africa is very much doubling its military expenditures. That's why one of the reasons why they've had to come over here for loans is for this military budget. Now, obviously, it's to protect investments such as Tsumeb. I mean, if it's 80% of the extraction, of the metal extraction for the economy, obviously it's very important to them. So they're very much involved in protecting that. But also we get back into the whole idea of the U.S. government protecting the capital investment overseas. And I think that, again, here, if Tsumeb was threatened and U.S. investments were threatened, we would find either U.S. support for these military installations or direct, maybe not so much troop, but direct military hardware support to the South Africans. So I think they're very much drawn into that. Not only the U.S., I mean, we have Germany, Italy, and other countries directly supporting the military buildup.
So I understand that France has
during the territory. The court spent 6 years considering it and finally came to the conclusion that it didn't have jurisdiction to answer the question. At that point, the United Nations said, enough is enough. We feel that the South Africans have treated Namibia so badly that they have, in effect, said, we are not fit to be a mandatory power. It's as if a guardian were to constantly whip and abuse the person under his care, and the court would say, we think you are no longer fit to be a guardian of this person. We will remove you as a guardian. So the United Nations said, we will revoke the mandate, and we, the United Nations, will ourselves administer the territory. At that point, and from that point forward, that was 1966, South Africa had no more right to be in the territory, to administer it, to govern it, to license corporations to come in and exploit minerals than, say, Afghanistan or the United States had. It was a foreign country. It was there by force. It was exercising its government, and it continues to exercise its administration there in exactly the same way that Nazi Germany did when it occupied France or Belgium or Holland or Norway. South Africa was a foreign occupying power with no right whatsoever. This is a crucial fact in the entire legal history of what has gone on in Namibia. South Africa has no legal right to be there, has no right to allow Tsumeb to operate there, has no right to collect taxes, has no legal rights there any more than any other country on the face of the earth. On the other hand, as we all know, the mere fact that you don't have rights to do something doesn't necessarily mean that you don't do it. South Africa is still physically there as an occupying force. The legal government is the General Assembly of the United Nations, but you really can't have 142 countries whose representatives meet once a year attempting to administer the territory. So the United Nations General Assembly created the Council for Namibia. I work for the Commissioner, the Office of the Commissioner for Namibia. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Council. The United Nations created the Council for Namibia to act as the day-by-day legal administering authority until such time as Namibia becomes independent and has its own government. It's an interim, transitional, legal government until free elections can be organized in the territory and the people of Namibia can create their own constituent assembly, which can decide what kind of a constitution they want and set up the means for the people of Namibia to take over their own government and run themselves. Because South Africa is physically in place, the Council has had to operate from the outside. It operates basically from New York at the United Nations headquarters. It has a regional office, or the Commissioner has a regional office in Lusaka, which is the center of most of the Namibian refugees. There is another regional office about to open up in Botswana. Many of the refugees are now coming across the border into Botswana from Namibia. The United Nations has set up an institute for Namibia in Lusaka in an attempt to train Namibians to run their own government, because their educational system is so awful, so incredibly awful for blacks. There are very few black children who go further than the first 2 or 3 grades if they go that far. Most Africans who get a good education eventually leave the country and get their education outside. There are several hundred Namibians in all parts of the world, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, Britain, West Germany, the United States, some of them in the African territory and the African continent, who are in school in universities, who have university degrees. Many of them have PhDs. That is a small nucleus of highly trained people who, when Namibia becomes independent, will be able to run their government. But between those people who have managed to escape and get education and the ordinary Namibian, there is an enormous gap because of the bad quality of the schools. And therefore, the Namibia Institute is an attempt to train on a crash basis Namibians who have had some education, who have left the country, but who are not qualified for university education, to train them to come back to Namibia in a very short time. We all hope that it will be a very short time before Namibia will get its independence. To train them to go back as administrators, as clerks, as people who understand what the problems of their government are and how to solve at least one area in which they've had specialized training. They can't be given the full gamut of university education, but they can be trained to know something about the particular area that they're interested in. The Institute also carries on research, because we fear very much, of course, that with an independent Namibia, one might be faced with the fact that the South Africans would destroy all the records, eliminate the archives, and Namibians would go back to a country with no records, nothing to work on, and this is a very serious situation. So that the Institute is attempting to build up its own research archives, to do research on issues which have been considered unimportant for the mere black people of Namibia, so that when they go back, they will not only be trained in specialties, but they will have done research in those areas and will have some background so that they will know what are the major health problems, where they're located, what kinds of services are needed and so on. This has been one of the important functions of the United Nations. Another one has been to enact Namibia Decree Number 1 for the protection of the natural resources of Namibia. This decree says that the natural resources of Namibia belong to the people, and that they may not be passed out by the South African government. Only the Council for Namibia, acting on behalf of the Namibian people, can, until independence, license anybody to exploit those minerals under the conditions that the Council lays down for their proper exploitation. And anybody who exploits minerals or exports minerals under a license from any other source, i.e. South Africa, of course, exports them illegally, and that the minerals or other products, whatever they may be seized any place in the world for the benefit of the Namibian people. Obviously, this is easier said than done for a great many reasons, most of which are technical, some of which are legal, some of which are factual. But there has been some effect. A number of oil companies exploring for oil offshore in Namibia have decided to leave and not continue their exploration. We attribute this partly to the decree, partly to stockholder pressure, and partly probably to the fact that they had some inkling that there was no exploitable oil which could be gotten out within the next few years, and the country is too unstable, the political situation is too unstable to invest if you can't get your money out fast. I think it would be wrong to say that any one of these factors by itself would necessarily have stopped the oil companies. However, they did stop. As we all know, Tsumeb has not. The United States has as yet not expressed any opinion on the validity of the decree. It has said, as Milo Ann pointed out, that it would not protect any American investor against any action taken by a future government of Namibia if the American corporation went in after 1966, after the revocation of the mandate. Otherwise, that is probably a stronger position than that taken by any other Western country whose nationals have investments in Namibia, which of course demonstrates in part how weak positions are. The United States has had a very ambivalent position, which appears to be negative, on economic boycotts as a weapon to try to bring about change in Namibia. It has, as we know, vetoed proposals for arms embargo against South Africa to bring about change in Namibia. If you have read today's paper, you will notice that the 5 Western members of the Security Council plan to have meetings with the Prime Minister of South Africa next Wednesday to discuss a solution of the Namibian problem. Whether this will go beyond the abortive solution of the Zimbabwe problem, which we knew about last fall, of course, remains to be seen. I think perhaps I should stop now and answer questions.
I heard on the news this evening that there was a discussion again about a fund by the American government, which sounded precisely like the fund that was talked about last year to the Rhodesian settlers, only this time it included the Namibians, and it was to aid the majority regime. And I wondered if this was simply old wine in new bottles.
I wish I knew the answer to that. It does sound very much like it, although the amount is quite different. The Zimbabwe fund they were talking about in the nature of $1,500,000,000. This one is a small, by those standards, $100 million. It seems much too small to buy out white settlers that want to leave. It's not at all clear to me what the fund is for, and I think we're going to have to wait for some further explanation, because the news stories are simply inadequate to have any real idea.
Yes, I understand there's a committee of 24 on decolonization at the UN. I'd like a little bit of information on that body, and I would like to compliment you on the way you denounced the South African illegal government. But at the same time, I would like to ask you a question. Can you identify any other people or bodies that are functioning in Africa that are holding that same frame of reference in terms of illegal governments? So the first question or statement would be, I would like some information on the Committee of 24 on decolonization. And second, if you could give us some examples or information towards some other people that you would accept as being in the same posture as that body in South Africa that you mentioned, illegal governments.
Well, let me start on the Decolonization Committee, which has a long title of about 25 words, Special Committee and so forth. That was established at a time when most of Africa, and I guess probably some of Asia, was still colonial territory, and its function has diminished, or at least the number of countries, territories to which it can direct its efforts has diminished as most of Africa has obtained its independence. There are only a handful of territories left, particularly since the end of Portuguese colonial rule, that come under the Decolonization Committee. Namibia, Zimbabwe, what used to be known as French Somaliland, which is going to have its fate settled one way or another, and some Pacific territories and odds and ends like Gibraltar, Pitcairn Island. The major territories now are Namibia and Zimbabwe. The others are relatively small pieces of territory scattered around all over the earth. There's a nice question, for example, as to whether or not Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands fall within or without the jurisdiction of the Committee of 24. As for the second question, Namibia is considered in every sense unique because it was an international territory in the sense that the mandate was an international system, and South Africa was at all times, theoretically at least, responsible to the League of Nations for its administration of Namibia, and after the League was defunct, to the United Nations. In that sense, it is a wholly unique territory, and there is nothing ever like it, because there has never been another territory except for very, very short periods of time. West Irian, for example, for a short time. I believe Libya for a short time, but for practical purposes, there has only been one territory that qualifies as really international territory, over which the United Nations has said that we hold ourselves out as the proper and lawful administrators. So in that sense, there is nothing like it in the world. Perhaps the second the closest territory would be Zimbabwe, which is technically British territory, but the British did turn to the United Nations and ask for help in ending the unlawful UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence. And to the extent that Britain went to the United Nations and said, please help us, that becomes an international territory which is unlawfully governed at this point, or unlawfully under unlawful administration at this point. When you get to other territories, you are then talking about individual judgments of particular countries or particular people, and not a stand which is taken by the United Nations as an organization. As you understand, when the Security Council acts, it must act with the consent of the 5 major powers. If any one of them vetoes, even though every other member of the Security Council is for an action, the action fails. In the General Assembly, you act normally by a normal majority, although in certain cases there must be a 2/3 majority. But for practical purposes, a General Assembly resolution which does not have overwhelming support is a very weak resolution, since the General Assembly can, in the first place, under normal circumstances, there are some abnormal circumstances, and Namibia is one of them, but normally the General Assembly can only recommend. It has no binding force to its resolutions. So that the United Nations functions mainly as a large number of individual nations speaking, and only rarely does it function as an organization itself. And so that many things which are considered bad by many countries do not come within any general judgment by the United Nations. In the subject of Palestine, you get into a question of certainly of acknowledgement by both the General Assembly and to some extent by the Security Council that certain parts of Palestine are wrongly held by Israel, and that would undoubtedly fall within the general definition. But in that sense, you have a very peculiar, you have a different situation from that in Zimbabwe, because in Zimbabwe, the lawful authority said, come in and help us, which is a little different from the way the Palestinian issue has arisen in the United Nations. It's a very arcane and technical subject, which is, you could write a whole long dissertation on precisely what falls on what side of the line in terms of what status things have at the United Nations. But Namibia is truly unique because it is the only territory which is UN territory until such time as the people have had a free chance to choose their own government. It is UN territory, pending proper opportunity for the people themselves to set up their own government. It's a unique situation.
Mr. Ladness, I also like to compliment you on your research and documentation of the problem in Namibia. But I'd like to ask you, first, 2 questions. One, I would like to know, you said the United States had said that she wouldn't come to the support of any of these multinational companies. Did the United States ever restrict any of these multinational companies from working and operating in Namibia?
The United States, when it learns about a company that is going into Namibia, particularly if it learns about it through the State Department, the Commerce Department tends to have the opinion that profitable investment is profitable investment. But if the State Department learns that an American company is going to invest in Namibia, it writes a letter to the company, which, as I understand it, I've never seen one of the letters, says, we want to call your attention to the following. The United States position is so-and-so, there are such and such resolutions. We think you will be subject to certain the United States will not protect you if your investment is challenged. The United States will not give you insurance guarantees and so on. However, if you do go in, please treat your employees well.
My second question would be, what is the United Nations position going to be when South Africa is now in the process of trying to establish a neo-colonial government in Namibia? What is the United Nations response going to be? Will that be acceptable to the United Nations?
The United Nations has said repeatedly through Security Council resolutions that any settlement in Namibia must be on the basis of Security Council Resolution 385, of which I have a copy here. And that resolution, among other things, requires free elections, territory-wide elections, not by tribal area, but across the whole territory, under United Nations supervision and control. And I emphasize the and control, because supervision may simply mean a few observers here and there watching what goes on. And control implies that the United Nations would be responsible for the establishment of electoral lists, for the seeing that campaigning was fair, for the making sure that those who are entitled to vote would vote, and for seeing that the ballots are properly counted. That's quite different from mere supervision. And one of the important provisions of Resolution 385 is that a government must be set up on the basis of free elections under UN supervision and control.
Yes, Ms. Landis, I'd like to ask you, the United States is not a signatory to the Treaty on Genocide, is it?
No, I don't believe so.
We've seen a lot of violations of human rights that have been either condoned or passed over by the United States government historically. We see the violation of Native American treaty rights, violation of human rights of blacks and other minorities here within the United States. And I don't know a lot about, law, but I know in some court cases where someone knows of an act of robbery or an act of a felony that's committed against another individual by someone else, they're often called an accomplice. Are the violations of human rights that are taking place in Namibia covered or spoken to under the treaty, the UN Treaty on Genocide? Would they be characterized as genocidal acts, some of the conditions to which the Namibian people live under?
Well, I'm sure that there would be one group of jurists who would say so. I would suppose that there would be another group of jurists who would not. This would be a philosophical question which you would debate in an appropriate court if you could ever get people before a court to debate it. I have my own personal opinion on that, but that's personal and not UN opinion. I would think that one could argue a very strong case on the subject, and my impression is that there have been some treatises written on this subject. Even, I believe that there have been at least one law review article written by a South African on the subject who concludes that no, it isn't genocide, but the UN might well treat it as such.
All right, one last question. What is the relationship between the Council of Namibia of the UN and the liberation movement, SWAPO? And also, what is the official position, or is there one, from the Council on the group which the South African government has been promoting? I believe they call it the Windhoek Conference. Could you fill us in about that?
First question on the relationship between the Council and SWAPO. SWAPO is recognized by the United Nations as the authentic representative of the Namibian people. A SWAPO observer sits with the council at all times that he's physically present. SWAPO has a one-man office in New York, so that it is not always available. But SWAPO sits with the council, has the right to participate in all their discussions, but not to vote. Normally, when the council sends a mission to, for example, take part in a conference on the law of the sea, a SWAPO representative will go with the mission sent by the council to help represent Namibia. The second question on the Windhoek Conference, which is commonly called the Turnhalle Conference. It's called that because that's the German word for the old drill hall, which was converted for the use of this conference. The Council has made it, Council for Namibia has made it very clear that it will have no truck whatsoever with the Turnhalle Conference, that the only possible way in which independence can be brought about that will be recognized is under the terms of Security Council Resolution 385, based on free elections under United Nations supervision and control, that it will under no circumstances recognize any deliberations which are done on a fragmented Bantustan tribal basis rather than on taking Namibia as a whole. The Council looks upon the Turnhalle Conference as essentially a way of creating a weak, dependent, divided Namibia, which will always, in fact, be subject to South African rule from behind the scenes rather than now as it is imposed immediately and publicly. The Turnhalle Conference itself has made very clear that for the indefinite future, it would insist upon having South African troops there to defend any government that it established, because it recognizes that certainly SWAPO and probably the vast majority of the Namibian people would never accept a Turnhalle government, so that what has up to this time been a war of liberation might well turn into a civil war if there were a Turnhalle puppet government with black fighting black and the Turnhalle blacks supported by South African support troops.
This evening, we've heard the horrible conditions imposed on the Namibian people by foreign corporations. The Tsumeb Corporation is controlled by Amex and another American company, are the largest employer in all of Namibia. We know that the United States government is capable of controlling its companies if it so chooses. We've seen a generation of control of trade with Cuba, even to the point of preventing other nations' companies of operating in Cuba, and even preventing the shipment of medical supplies to Cuba. Is the United States government not directly responsible for conditions in Namibia?
The United States government position, as I understand it, is that it believes in free enterprise, and it can persuade, it can urge, it can do nothing more, and this is the position, by and large, of the Western European countries, that they have no control over what their companies do in a free enterprise system. It is naturally responsible for the attitude of many Namibians vis-a-vis free enterprise.
One last question. The Dean of American Newscasters, Eric Sevareid, just a few months ago made a statement on television that there is nothing in all of Africa of value to civilized man that was not put there by the West. If if this is representative of American thought, and in particular of the attitude of the American government and the media toward Africa, have we reason to believe, in fact, that the national attitude toward Namibia and toward Africa in general is simply an extension of American racism?
Well, as a UN employee, I couldn't possibly answer that question, but I should think that the grand jury might be able to answer it without any guidance from me.
The $100 million fund we spoke about earlier, which is similar to the Kissinger's plan for Zimbabwe. If that wasn't cleared through the UN's Council on Namibia, or at least some sort of consultation had not been undertaken by the U.S. and that council, could this project, this offer, be considered a circumvention of the UN Council on Namibia?
Well, it's pretty hard to know exactly what this fund is all about. I mean, all I've done is read the same news reports that you've read, so that I just don't know what the answer is. I am under the impression that what they are saying is that this would aid in the transition period when Namibia had its independence, so that you would have to then go back to the chicken and egg question of what kind of independence was this meaningful independence brought about under the terms of Resolution 385, or is it a kind of a Turnholla government, which is something entirely different? I mean, we're arguing about something, or you're asking about something I just don't know enough about.
I'm asking you if it was discussed with the UN's Council on Namibia first.
No.
Then it has not been cleared in any way by the UN. That if there's been no consultation with that council, then it can't be considered a council's policy. Is that correct?
That's correct.
My other question is, the council, you say, has the authority to license companies, and has it done so?
No, it has not.
Have companies applied to the council for licensure?
While I've been in the office, I've received about half a dozen telephone calls asking about licensing, and each time I have said, please submit your questions in writing, indicating who you are by name, what company you represent, what you're interested in. And my anonymous telephone callers, who are different, have all not written anything.
They've never identified themselves?
Usually not. Once in a while I've gotten so far as to push somebody into admitting what law firm he or she works for, but that's as far as it's ever gone.
Yes, I'd like to talk a little bit about people. I'd like to ask you a question about people. I've heard a lot of talk about governments and money, but I've heard no talk about the people of Africa. And it appears to me, it really appears to me that the white man, again, with the yellow, the black, and the red people, always think that he is incapable of handling his own affairs. If these governments and these oil companies and these coal companies, if they're forced out of Africa, and you said that they're educating people in different parts of the world to come into Africa and take over, isn't this just an extension of the white way that these black people were educated, that they're bringing back into Africa? And another question is, I like to ask, what will happen to the uneducated black who cannot read, who's just a hardworking person, when these new governments take over?
Well, the hope is that those Namibians, and we're not talking about foreigners now, we're talking about Namibians who have been educated, will be teachers and nurses and will be performing vital services. I don't want to get into the philosophical question of whether people are better off without any Western education or not. But once you know that people's lives can be saved by inoculating against smallpox, it's pretty hard to turn your back on it and say we won't inoculate. The philosophical problem of what you do about basic education, whether people are taught to read and write at all, and if they're taught to read and write, shouldn't they be taught to read and write well, so that they can read what they want to and pass their own judgments? Is, you're getting into a really philosophical question. I think it is completely true that people who go away from their own country, when their own country is a developing country, frequently are corrupted by the luxury and the different ways of life of the places where they go. And this is one of the reasons why the Institute for Namibia was set up in Lusaka, which was at that time physically as close as you could get in any place where you could really assemble a lot of people together. The nearest country that had the facilities and could absorb the number of people involved. And that was one of the very important reasons for having the institute established in Lusaka, so that it would be close to home. There would be constant ebb and flow of people going back and forth across the border. People would keep in touch with their families and would be in a country that was not so advanced that they couldn't go back to other and simpler conditions when the time came. Beyond that, when you're getting into the question of emigres and what happens to people who go out, what happens to people once they've been to Paris and whether they go back to the farm again, that's a philosophical question that you just have to decide for yourself. I mean, the UN cannot take a position on something like that, because it's beyond any kind of simple, even a simple political answer.
In answer to the juror's question about license, you said some law firms had called for license.
Had called for information.
For information. Could you identify who those law firms?
I don't think I even remember now, but I wouldn't if I could.
Okay. Like to say, in all of the actions that the UN has taken in sanctioning South Africa's control over Namibia, what has been America's stand in each one of in this role when they've taken votes in it? Has it abstained or has it supported these sanctions?
Well, there really hasn't been much of anything that you can call sanctions. Let's start with that.
Well, when the vote was taken that they illegally occupied.
There are resolutions every year. During the Kennedy administration, the United States probably took a stronger position than most of Western Europe. Obviously, it did not take as strong a position as Eastern Europe or a majority of the African states. In recent years, the United States position has, from the African point of view, been getting progressively worse. The United States joined twice in vetoes of proposed arms embargo against South Africa based on its operations in Namibia. I mean, there might be other reasons for embargoing arms to South Africa, but this was a specifically Namibia-based operation. These were resolutions which would have followed up on Resolution 366 and 385. 366 and 385 are substantially the same. Everybody is now very interested